Welcome to Perspectives El Paso. I'm Leon Blevins, Professor of Government at El Paso Community College. As some of you have heard me say before, many years ago I taught at Texas Western College. From 1964, I was taking some graduate classes and then wrote my master's thesis there and finished a master's there in 1967. So I was teaching and writing while I was there. Met a lot of interesting people. Among the most interesting people we had at that time in 1966 was a group of 12 young men. I was 29 years of age in 1966, and I have a picture here of the basketball players, the Texas Western College Miners, and was able to put together this composite picture from a picture I had in my files, put the names and their numbers there, the basketball team, and they became national basketball champions in 1966. Just recently, early February of this year, here we are at the 19th of March in 2016. This is the anniversary, the 50th anniversary of the championship game that was won by Texas Western Miners. As of this date, the only Texas college to win an NCAA national championship from the state of Texas. So recently I was able to get all of these members that were in town, and one that was out of town, I mailed him a copy of this and got him to autograph it. So these are original autographs of the players. Most of them were in their 20s, early 20s. A very famous writer, a sports writer here in El Paso at that time, and he's still writing. His name is Ray Sanchez. He started writing, well, I'm going to let him tell about that. In fact, I need to mention that in his career as a writer, he's seen a lot of changes in the methods of writing. I think he started off doing pictographs out at Waco Tanks. And then I think he transferred from that to a quill pen. And then eventually he moved to a typewriter, and now of all things, he's using a computer. This is Ray Sanchez, premier sports writer of El Paso, Texas.
Oh, it's so nice being with you today.
Do you really go back that far?
No, not quite, but almost.
Okay, well then tell us a little bit about your history, where you went to high school, and how you got into writing, especially a sports column.
Well, you know, I went to El Paso High School, and you know, how I got into writing was strictly without any idea that I was going to be a writer.
Okay.
I had a teacher by the name of Maud Isaacs.
I've heard of her.
I'm telling you, she was so strict and she was tough, and boy, I tell you, if you split an infinitive or ended a sentence with a preposition, she'd jump on you like, we all disliked her terribly. Oh, she was scary and she was spooky.
That sounds familiar to Don Haskins. Many of these players didn't like him because he was too strict,
exactly
but
right.
Later they appreciated him.
Oh, and I tell you, I appreciated, for some reason, every time I wrote an essay, she would give me an A or an A+. Mm-hmm. And or she would write something like, "This is very good." Mm-hmm. And one day she wrote on top of one of my essays, she says, "You should be a writer." And this is how a teacher can influence your life. Because when I went into the service after I graduated from high school.
That was World War II?
And I went overseas, and I was, it was towards the end of the war in 1945.
Okay.
So I was part of the Army of Occupation, you know.
Okay.
But anyway, so when I came back, the only way I was going to go to college was if I had the GI Bill of Rights. And luckily I had the GI Bill of Rights. Yeah. Anyway, I enrolled at UTEP, and I remember going up, and they asked me, "Well, what's your major?" And I said, "What's a major?" I didn't know anything.
A new word.
I mean, I was really from the poor side of town, you know. And anyway, and they explained to me what a major was, something you should study for. Mm-hmm. So I says, well, you know, I already knew English and Spanish when I went into the service. Okay. And then I picked up some German, and I picked up some French when I was overseas. I was stationed in both countries. So I said, I just popped out and said, languages. And then they said, well, okay, I was going to be a language professor. That was my goal at that time. And then they asked me, well, what do you like for a minor? And a minor, what's that? They explained what a minor was. So I thought, and that's when the teacher had influenced me, Miss Isaacs, and now I love her. Now I think she's the greatest thing that ever happened to me in life.
So you became a
next
writer.
to my wife, yeah. So I said journalism. Well, to make a long story short, even my professor said at UTEP, which was then Texas Western, by the way, even they liked my essays. So I started getting A pluses in journalism and and B pluses in languages.
Wow.
So I changed my major. Of
Well,
course.
how did it happen you started specializing in sports?
Well, I'll tell you what. You know, the World War II was a horrible thing,
Yeah.
but it's the greatest thing that ever happened to the United States. In another way, in a good way, because suddenly, you know, Europe was devastated.
Right.
I saw all the devastation. Japan was leveled. And here we were, all of a sudden, we had been the poorest, one of the poorest countries in the world, and all of a sudden, we were the richest because we were the only manufacturers that could supply people from either Europe, so we went from poor to rich. Mm-hmm. And I remember our sports editor at the El Paso Herald-Post, whose name was Bob Ingram. He had been the only one in the sports staff, and he only became a sports editor, because someone had the bright idea in the 1930s. They sat around with the editor, and someone had the bright idea, you know, sports articles used to run on the front page or the third page or the fifth page. And someone had the bright idea and said, why don't we put all the sports together? Because sports were beginning to grow after World War II, you know. Now we had boxing and all, wrestling even, and football and basketball. And someone said, why don't we put them all together? And the editor turned around and said, do we have a volunteer to handle that? Bob Ingram raised his finger, and he became the sports editor. Oh, wow. And you know, he worked for, let's see, he got there in the early 1920s, and that happened in 1928. So he was the only sports editor until 1949, when someone had the bright idea. I said, let's give him an assistant, because sports were growing, schools were being added. Right. So now all of a sudden he needed an assistant. So he called UTEP. And just by luck, he got hold of Pete Snelson. I don't know.
I knew Pete Snelson, not well, but I knew him.
He was teaching journalism at that time. And he says, oh yeah, I got just the boy for you. He says, well, it's for the sports. He says, well, yeah. I had just written an essay on Jackie Robinson breaking the color line in the major leagues, and he loved it. So he says, yeah, I'll send this young man down to you. So I walk into the office, and they gave me, and I said, Bob Ingram says, well, okay, go cover this freshman game. It's a freshman between UTEP and New Mexico State. So I went, I covered it, and I got some quotes, and I went back, and I wrote my story, and they hired me on the spot. So suddenly, here I was, a journalist instead of a language professor, and a sports journalist.
You were supposed to be a writer. She knew it all along.
Yeah, and it's been a wonderful, wonderful career, really.
Well, I know you've not only written columns, but you've written several books.
Oh, and stories. Oh,
and just last week, my wife and I, Shanna and I, we met your wife, Helen, and you.
Yes.
And visited a little while, and I bought a copy of the book from you.
Yes.
I read it over the weekend.
Oh, man.
Now, as I read this, of course, the first part of it has a lot to do with each of the individual players. You have something to say about every one of these players. I was anxious to get to about the middle of the book. I think it's chapter 14, where you start picking up on the games and the routes that they took to the national championship.
Yes.
And as I read some of this, it was like I was listening to a radio, a play-by-play, calling and describing exactly all of the moves of the players on the field. How did you end up writing it that way? Did you go look at newspapers from the other cities writing?
Well, first of all, I interviewed the coach. You know, I also wrote the biography of Don Haskins.
Okay.
You know, it's called Haskins, the Bear Facts, you know, because he looked like a bear.
Right.
But anyway, so he and I spent many hours together writing his biography. And can I tell you how that happened?
Sure.
That I wrote his biography. One day I got the bright idea in 1985 to write his biography. So I go up to Haskins and says, Don, I would like to write your autobiography. Yeah, no, he says, you know Haskins, how he was. He was, I don't want anything. I pleaded and I begged and I almost got down on my knees. Don, you'll love it. It's going to be very successful. He said, well, so finally he agreed, but he agreed only one way. He says, if you meet me at Coronado Country Club every morning at 6 a.m., and so I can have breakfast and we can talk while I have breakfast, and then I can go play golf. This was in the summer, obviously.
Okay.
So I said, okay, I would do anything to write his biography. So I went and I took my little tape recorder up there, and while he was eating breakfast, of course he was in good spirits usually when eating breakfast, and so he started telling me the story of his life and how he grew up. He had been a great pitcher. He could have been to the major leagues, but he hurt his arm pitching, you know. But anyway, so I wrote his story. So, and that's how I wrote this book about how the miners won the championship. First of all, I interviewed each player.
Okay.
You know, and it was quite a chore, you know, getting hold of each one. So I presented them as, you know, one by one. You know, the amazing...
You humanized it. They were humans.
Yes, they were. You know, it's the funniest thing. You know, the stereotype of a black, of an African American from a big city is that he comes from the ghetto, and and not only that, but that he comes from a broken family. Unbelievably, and I think that's why Haskins recruited them. Every one of those, all 7 of the black players came from very solid families. Every father except Latin. His father died at 7, but his mother raised him. But all the other players had hard-working fathers who helped mold them and send them. So here it was. Haskins won out with 7 black players, and of course 5 white players who also came from good families.
Right.
And they all had character. You know, you put basketball, the ability to play basketball and character together, and you've got a winner. And they all, you know, in one of my columns, I said, these are men of character. And that's true. Every one of them had character, came from a good family, and had the ability to play basketball. What a great combination. I think that's one of the reasons, besides Haskins' coaching, of course, that they became champions, national champions.
Yeah. In the Greek, as I learned it years ago, didaskalos, to teach, from which we get the word discipline.
Yes.
Discipline.
Yes.
Disciplinarian. The people that you studied under, disciplinarians. Bob Ingram, I'm sure, was a disciplinarian. Get out there and get that story and get it on time. Yeah. You had to do all of those things. Now,
when I became sports editor, I was a disciplinarian too.
Now we need to give a chance for the people to know more about this. Basketball's biggest upset, and that's defeating the University of Kentucky in 1966 in the championship game. Give us a telephone number or a website or something so anybody could contact you if they
they
want
can
to.
call me personally. You know, the book's been out for 30 years now,
Right.
so but you can go to Amazon.com. You could go to Barnes and Noble and order it, but you know, I don't want to tout Amazon, but I have to.
Okay.
If you call Amazon, if you go into Amazon and order any one of my books, you know, I've written 7 books on sports,
Okay.
and every one of them, just about everyone has mentioned the minors, from 66. But if you go to Amazon, they call you, and I can have it in your house the next day.
Well,
I mean,
Americans
it's
like
amazing.
that. We
But
like
if
it
you
now.
go to Barnes and Noble, I mean, they'll order it, but it'll take about 3 or 4 weeks.
Yeah.
So any one of my books, Haskins, the Haskins biography, Basketball's Biggest Upset, I wrote the history of the minors, and of course I wrote the history of sports in El Paso, and all of them have mentioned the minors. And then I wrote other books, you know. But yeah, it's been quite a career. But you know, the minors winning the national championship, of course, is the highlight of my entire career.
It's one of the highlights of El Paso history.
Yeah, Bob Paso.
Really
I didn't get to cover the game. Bob Ingram was still the sports editor, so he went to cover the game. But I covered the celebration here in El Paso that night.
Yeah.
It was the greatest thing. I mean, the whole town went bonkers.
Yeah, my
Really?
wife. Yeah, my wife and I lived on this east side of town, and we had 2 sons at that time, Timothy and Michael Keith, and we bought them little shirts that said "I'm a little miner," and so we were celebrating. We were very busy with teaching and working and everything, and I didn't get to go to a lot of the games. The parade that I went to was on campus the next day.
Yes,
after the night
next
before,
day.
they had a parade on campus,
Yeah.
and I was out there to be able
Sure.
to see that. It was a highlight for El Paso. There's no doubt about that.
Oh, I'm telling you, you know, as soon as the game ended late at night, 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock or whatever, and boy, it seemed like everybody in El Paso ran out of their homes and jumped in cars and went all around town tooting their horns and shouting, number one. It was sheer bedlam downtown.
Well,
I don't know if you went downtown, but if you stayed away, you were lucky, because I went down there in my own car tooting my horn, and it was sheer bedlam. I mean, people were popping firecrackers, sending rockets, yelling and screaming and hugging each other and kissing each other. It seemed like well, I can compare it to VE Day.
I remember
that. Where everybody was so happy and shouting. Guys were sitting on the windows of their car or on top of their car driving.
Well, I have a funny story I'll share with you on that. Willie Cager, a famous player on this team, he and his family moved next door to us in 1986, so we became friends with them over the years. And we've told this story, I interviewed him and told this story, that the night of that big game, we had pulled a mattress into the living room. We lived in an apartment over here on the east side, had it on the floor. We had a little black and white TV. We were lying there so we could see it. We'd put the kids to bed. And at some point, my wife fixed some tuna fish sandwiches for us to have, and chips and stuff. And we got so excited in the midst of all of this. I think it may have been when Bobby Joe did 2 back-to-back steals. She threw the tuna fish sandwiches all over the living room. She got so excited, she just threw them all over. And that was the kind of bedlam that was going on, even happening in the homes here in El Paso.
Yes, it was unbelievable. And you know, when 10,000 people showed up the next day when the miners came at the airport, when the miners came home, and who was the first person out of the airplane holding up the trophy?
Willie Cager.
Willie Cager. Yeah.
An iconic picture.
Oh, it was such a wonderful time.
Well,
and the next day, you know, they took him that morning on a motorcade throughout El Paso.
Right.
And they had people, you know, cheering them and hollering and clapping, and it was just a wonderful scene. And then, and you know that the night of this, when they won the championship, they had a big bonfires or several bonfires at the campus, yeah. And the next night they tried to start another one. Well, maybe you were there that night, but the next night, they started another one. But the celebration started to get a little rowdy, and I remember, and I was there, and this police captain. I have the name in the book, but I forget. But he went through there and shouting, and with a microphone and just telling everybody, okay, you all are number one in the country. Please don't get out of hand. I mean, don't let your celebration get. And that sort of settled the crowd down.
Well, the players that I've interviewed for my television show, none of them had seen this picture that I put together because it was taken by someone from a Juarez newspaper.
Those are piñatas down
These are piñatas down here. They had never seen that photograph. But they all said, unanimously in the interviews, they said they did not like Don Haskins until they realized that he had taught them so much.
He made them champions.
And then they began to like him.
Yeah.
And they all talked about how it had affected their lives as adults.
Yes.
Now, all of them had their own flaws and their own problems in their own lives as they went on, but they learned, you said they had character, but they even learned more.
Yes.
They also told us, and you've heard Don say this, that they did not think about this as being a landmark case. They just wanted to play basketball and win.
Correct.
And they were very confident that they were going to win once they got to going, and they beat Iowa, they beat Utah, and so on as they went further along. They knew they were going to win the championship.
Yes. And you know, there's a misconception about why Haskins started 5 black players. And he told me, you know, in the many hours that we spent together doing his biography, he says, Ray, when I started the 5 black players, I didn't do it because they were black. He said, you know, Kentucky didn't have a big team, but they were very quick. So I tried to counteract that quickness. I picked my 5 quickest players. That they happened to be black, that was my decision. They just happened to be black. But that's why I started them. I wasn't trying to make a statement or anything, but and sure enough, it worked. He says, between you and me, Kentucky found out what quick really meant.
Oh, yes. Well, Willie Worsley...
The minders were so much quicker, you know.
Well, Willie Worsley tells a story that, and he was here for this reunion just recently, that when Willie was named, he thought it was Willie Cager he was going to put in that night for starting. And he said, Willie Worsley. And he was the shortest one.
Yes.
But he was so quick and he was accurate with his shooting.
Yes.
And so it was a wise move. And he was a defensive player and could work against those people from
You know what Haskins said? Technically, he was even a better defensive player than Bobby Joe Hill. Worsley was. Yeah, and he wasn't very big, but you know, he was only 5'6", but do you know he could dunk? He could jump so high. He's probably the shortest player. Well, some of them may have come later, but he was the shortest player that had ever up to that time dunked a basketball.
Oh my goodness! Well, we only have 5 minutes left. This time goes so fast. We have a 28-minute program
already.
Let me ask you about your crystal moment as a career as a writer. What really stands out was that you weren't there in Maryland at College Park when that championship game took place, but in your writing along and you're thinking, this is a highlight of my writing career. Let's close on that note.
Well, I can also tell you my worst moment, but I can tell you my best moment, and of course it was this, winning the championship. I mean, think what it did. I mean, you got to remember, El Paso was a small town in those days.
Right.
I mean, very small. And here we all of a sudden, we were national champions. We had something to be proud of. We had something that we could brag about. It put us on the map. all of a sudden, we were nationally known. And all because of this little team. It just it changed everything for us. It changed our conception of basketball. It changed the whole country. Even teams in the South, which had been segregated, even Kentucky started recruiting black players. I mean, my goodness, and the statement they made that is just the greatest thing that ever happened to El Paso. We started to grow, we boomed, we were somebody finally, you know. It was just wonderful.
Well, it's my pleasure to have you on. You are, as somebody told me today when I told who I was interviewing, they said, he's an icon. So you are an icon.
Well, I've been called worse.
Oh, yes. But aren't you glad that Maud said, you ought to be a writer?
Oh, that's a great.
And you became a writer, and you've had a wonderful career.
If she hadn't put up those words on one of my essays, you should be a writer, no telling where I'd be now.
Well, all of us have something that we should be proud of.
Yes.
And you should be proud of every one of those little essays that you wrote for us to read.
Yes.
You didn't just share them with the teacher.
I wish I'd saved them.
The boxes got too full after all of those years.
Yeah, well, yeah.
There were just too many to save.
I do have the Jackie Robinson essay I wrote.
Oh, okay.
That's the one that, yeah.
So that you can share with other people in the future.
Yeah.
And you've been passing along your influence on others. And I want to say thank you, Mr. Sanchez.
Oh, thank you
for being a wonderful writer.
so much. It's been very nice talking to you.
Thank you for being here in El Paso for all of these years. We're glad you didn't move off to some big city somewhere.
I had my chances.
Okay, good. Well, thanks for watching. We've had a delightful guest today, and stay tuned and you'll see some more. And during this anniversary year, the 50th anniversary of the Texas Western Miners winning the national championship, we'll do a couple of more shows before the year is over. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Leon Blevins.